Okay, everybody, welcome to the Azure Meetup. We're going to get started here. I was trying to give enough time for whoever wants to show up to be able to make it with the traffic, but I guess they'll join us as they come in. So first and foremost, this is obviously a little different when we're doing a Azure Meetup at Linux Academy and Cloud Assessment. So we'll talk about kind of how we're venturing into an environment when we're actually named Linux Academy and the idea of cloud assessments and where that comes from. The approach has always been not only a Linux stack, but also to go after the cloud stack and the DevOps environments. So that's kind of why we forayed into the cloud environments such as AWS, Azure, and OpenStack. Just a quick run around to give you guys a little bit idea of who's in the room right now. We've got Davis, who's part of our production and analytics team. We've got Chaz, who's part of our event coordination team. Who's part of our talent team is Sarah's here as well. And we've also got Triva, who's actually an SME for our OpenStack side of the entire content division. So she's here as well. So let's talk about a couple of things we're going to be talking about here. Let me just go through. I didn't want to go through that fast. All right. So we will be covering a couple of things as we get the group up and running, because this is actually the second meeting for this group. So we're going to try and push for, and we want that type of communication back from you guys on what you guys want to see. We'll try and get boot camps, some hackathons going on, some things that involve networking events, and actually the general idea of if you guys got speaking engagements, you guys have people you want to speak or you want to speak yourself, definitely reach out to us. We want to have guest speakers get involved with the process as well, just as much as we want to be involved with trying to help you guys out into the direction where you guys want to go. So that's an overall direction where we want to take the meetup. Excuse me. So who am I? That's kind of the question mark a lot of people will have when they haven't met a presenter. So let me just run through that real fast. My name is Shahan Kareem. I'm actually a course author and SME at Linux Academy and Cloud Assessments. I played a mixed roles throughout my career, corporate and consulting environments, whether there were leadership roles or technical hands-on roles throughout my career. So now I get to actually be involved with helping all of you get to your goals and be able to get to the environments you guys want from either a learning goal or a business goal, or even if it's a hobbyist daily kind of new learning environment you get. That's kind of the pleasure I get out of this. So some of my experience does come from a hybrid cloud experience, so I'm not just tied to the Microsoft stack. I actually have a lot of experience with AWS as well as Google Cloud Platform, though I would love to have OpenStack on my list, but that is to be coming as well, but we've got awesome Triva for that. So the background behind a hybrid cloud environment allows us to discuss stuff like what we're going to do today with an on-prem discussion on how your on-prem environments get affected by decisions like what Microsoft's trying to do with the new Azure Stack product we're going to talk about today. You could find me at these locations, LinkedIn, as well as Twitter, in case you guys need to grab any type of knowledge or stuff that we're dropping. Here's just a quick set of kind of certifications and experience that I have, which is a very small list. I didn't want to really sit here and list it all out. But just to give you guys an idea, a little bit of enterprise architecture as well as cloud experience, as well as on-prem hands-on technical knowledge dealing with things like ITIL and other environments that have to deal with that enterprise kind of approach. So let's talk about real fast. I'm not really into kind of selling things, but I want you guys to understand why we have Linux Academy and Cloud Assessments, the idea behind it, what is there, and what I do and why I love being here. So one of the key things is, which I mentioned earlier, that I'm a course author here. So I'm involved with being able to create content for you guys and be able to actually get that type of knowledge to you so you guys are not spending the extra time to try and figure out things, instead of actually get to your goals, get to your career goals as well as your daily tasks that you like to make easier by learning some of this stuff. One of the things I love is being able to connect with humans, not just processes and metrics. This is my main thing, so I love collaborating with you guys. Definitely try and reach out. Any questions, get involved with our Linux Academy community Slack. That's one of the things I love, is that human interaction, instead of just delivering metrics to an organization and say, hey, this is what we did and this is what we accomplished. No, for me, what makes me the happiness concept is to be able to be part of that cutting edge learning environment that enables the success of others, which is a key part of what I enjoy doing daily. Of course, what we're here doing today, meet and talk tech. So you'll see us do a lot of podcasts and things like this, which is one of the things I love doing and get involved. Some of the courses that I've done here, I've done the PowerShell Essentials course. I've also done the Azure IoT, Azure IoT for Enterprises, the Microsoft Exam 7533, the Exam 7532. Welcome, come on in. No, that's all right. Food's over there. You're welcome to grab drinks and just make yourself comfortable. And of course, the PowerShell Core for Linux Admins course, which I don't know if everybody knows that a couple of things with Microsoft's new direction has been to open source a lot of their products that they're starting to become that bridges that gap. So .NET was open source, PowerShell was open source. So these are the kind of environments that Microsoft has gone towards that is a little bit new, that hasn't been around from how they've done business in the market for the last almost 10, 20 years. So our agenda today, what we're going to cover is what is Azure Stack and why it's a little different than the concept of a stack definition, and we'll talk about that in a moment here. We're going to talk about features of the product. We'll go over architectural differences between the cloud and Azure Pack, which is why is it different, what's making it different, why is it named the way it's named, and where we're going towards. We'll cover the developer kit that comes from Azure Stack for you guys to try and actually do this stuff on your own to test out the new product that they've launched. And we'll kind of round out the entire process with a Q&A. So before I get into it, does anybody have any questions? Concerns, comments, anything? Awesome. All right, excellent. So let's get started. So the idea here is, what is Microsoft Azure Stack? And one of the key things here is when we talk about Azure being a cloud solution platform, the difference is when we talk about the definition of stack, it always comes down to, well, we're talking about what entails an entire piece of technology, right? From the top to bottom, what are the resources, what are the features, what is the entire capability of this platform or product, and that's how we define it as a stack. Now, Azure Stack usually is kind of, in the last few months, has been confused with the concept when we talk about it is, oh, we're just talking about the Azure Cloud Platform. In reality, Azure Stack is a product that is part of the Azure environment that gives you the ability to have Azure as a data center product brought into your on-prem environment. And think of it this way, unplug the internet and still have Azure running locally. And how does that work? What does that give you capability-wise? That's what we're going to talk about today. And that's that difference is, from when I was a consultant, one of the issues that would come up is, well, how do we handle compliance? How do we handle security? How do we handle some of the financial industries, some of the government industries, the manufacturing industries that have these requirements that we can't just release our data to a third-party provider, because that becomes a problematic issue for us to get those compliance processes in place. So Azure is trying to mitigate that issue, having already been involved from Microsoft's background involved in these enterprise markets. Well, they wanted to bridge that gap, and that's where Azure Stack comes in. And it's really trying to bring that ecosystem of the data center with Microsoft Azure into one umbrella. And that's the key part of the discussion is, we all know from a professional standpoint, efficiencies are all about dealing with problems and dealing with things that are redundant, right? So if you're going to do something and you're doing it incorrectly or you're doing it multiple times over and over again, that is sometimes called an inefficient system. The issues that come up with that also has cost-related issues, but also has problems with decision-making processes. How do we scale? How do we train new employees? How do we get more people involved in our organization without causing too much disruptive environment? So the problem comes in is, well, I've got a solution that I want, but I don't want to deal with offloading it or on-premming it. So I want to bring it on-premise or offload it to an off-premise environment and harm either, say, for example, if I've got CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration or continuous delivery pipelines, is that going to be harmed by this or not? A lot of times when you've got a cloud solution environment, you want to be able to execute your cloud with agility, control, and flexibility, without having the harm that comes with that. So this is where the Azure Stack's concept is, to give you a cloud consistent delivery platform. This is what Azure wants to do by introducing the Azure Stack. Number one, give you a simplified abstracted experience, a write once, deploy anywhere concept. So what does that mean? Okay, well, I've got an application that I've locally written, I've deployed it out to my data center locally, but I want to be geographically redundant, or I want to lessen my latency by having things geographically redundant or be geographically replicated throughout the world, this will give you the ability to say, okay, well, I can not only deploy locally, but my deployment pipelines for my cloud are all the same. I don't have to retrain, I don't have to retool, all of it can be deployed with the same type of tooling or same type of knowledge space because it's one ecosystem. That gives you agility. Number two, control comes in the process. A unified configuration environment for provisioning and updating. You're reducing your developer chaos through a common service model and integrated IT and business processes. Anybody who's done a cloud migration has understood the complexity that comes in with understanding what you have already invested in locally versus where you want to go as your future for your scale and agility. When you tie in the ability to have an ecosystem that's the same, a lot of those decisions become very easy. They allow you to become not only agile, but you're not retraining your staff. You're not losing your ability to have developers join when they've already got that background and experience that's involved with that control environment. Also, the key concepts of security that is brought from cloud solution environment gives you a kind of peace of mind, but you also want to be able to mitigate that or duplicate that into your local on-prem environment. So this is where Azure Stack comes in and says, well, if you like the security that you're doing in your cloud, we can bring it to your local on-prem stack and give you the same type of role-based access controls and things like this that are part of, or if anybody's familiar with AWS, the IAM policies, and giving you that granular control over permission and security just as much as giving you that openness of administration that you would normally do in that environment. And of course, the flexibility. Having a one product ecosystem gives you the ability to have easier CI/CD pipelines by having a consistent API call stack. So you're dealing with one stack that has a roadmap that you can follow instead of numerous roadmaps that you have to then kind of deal with. Also, this gives you a flexibility concept that, for example, we know that the trend that's going on is going towards a hybrid cloud environment where either it's a hybrid where you'll have a one cloud solution provider and you'll have an on-prem data center, or you'll have it where you'll have an application that's dealing with multiple cloud environments. So you'll have maybe a product with AWS, maybe some features from Azure, maybe some stuff from Google Cloud environment. These type of hybrid scenarios gives you the flexibility when you have it on-prem and be able to then plug it into your on-prem environment that may already be set up for those other types of solutions that you've already got configured. So let's talk about what the idea of the power of the Azure Stack is. The key thing here is that your application innovation, your application innovation, your hybrid, hyperscale, and enterprise-grade environments that come with the app innovation cycle is wanting to not only bring it to the data center that's local, but also Microsoft Azure that's already in the cloud. Now, what you'll see is a very unique way of doing things where the duplications happen that you're not only getting your Windows Server and Linux options that were in the cloud, you're also getting them locally. You're getting the portals that you would normally be used to, your graphical user interfaces, those infrastructure as a services and platform as a services that you would see in the cloud is now going to be local as well. And things that normally would have been problematic as to how hypervisors work, and if anybody's done virtual machine migration, they've noticed some of the limitations that come up with console access and other stuff that you may not have because the solution provider can't provide that due to the way the hypervisor is set up inside the virtual machine. When you bring it on-prem, your administrators actually have access to that console environment that normally wasn't there before, so that's an added extra administration feature that is still being built in a lot of clouds that do have some options, but the idea of having a KVM style nested virtualization becomes more of a reality as you bring it on-prem and have more control over your hardware, which is one of the key things that Azure Stack is trying to push for. Now, let's talk about the architecture of how Azure Stack looks. From a concept, we know that the ecosystem has changed for Microsoft. It's all going to be based upon having a unified acceptance of OSs that are out in the market instead of pushing just one Windows as it's kind of done in the past. We've seen that it's very much picked up on Linux, but also picked up on things like the containers and the DevOps environments that is kind of being pushed, things like Kubernetes and Dockers and DCOS are all part of the DevOps tools, and that will all be part of your on-prem environment. So the concept is giving us the Azure Resource Manager model, which means automating deployments, having the same type. So if I create an automated desired state configuration for my cloud stack, I can use that exact same script, exact same fileage and usage for the local environment as well. Simply changing credentials would be the most you'd have to change to enable that cross functionality that's now built in to the Azure Stack environment. Of course, the idea is to have PaaS and IaaS services built into your local stack, as well as have them part of your cloud environments, and having that cloud-inspired infrastructure concept, right? Where if anybody's worked on in the past, when we're doing firewalls, we're doing security, things have changed substantially in giving us tools that make this a lot faster. When you try and actually articulate a firewall, back in the day when you're using even something that like IP tables or something that's very nominally rudimentary, actually did require a substantial amount of knowledge and work to make sure that you were able to set it up properly and have that configuration put into place. But here, you'll see that with AWS, with Azure, even with Google Cloud, it's literally usually click of a button, put in your port, and most of your security environments are set up quite quickly. So Azure wants to push that and say, well, we want to keep that same concept locally as well. So what you would understand as a virtual network in the cloud is going to be the exact same setup on your local on-prem Azure Stack machine that you're going to be setting up. Same thing with storage, same thing with compute, same thing with management, and same thing with security. Across those 5 realms that usually devolve or involved with the cloud stack, you'll have the same type of environment locally. All right, so let's talk about some use cases on how this actually works. One of the key things that changes the environment a little bit is to work on the edge and have disconnected solutions. So you can address latency and connectivity requirements by processing data locally in Azure Stack and then aggregating in Azure for further analytics with common application logic across both. Well, this is a little bit of a very odd way to define what an edge and disconnected solution is. So let me kind of simplify this. That's actually Microsoft's definition. So let's make this a little bit easier for you guys. Making it straightforward, think of it this way. If I'm on a ship that's a cruise line, I want to have the same type of cost and virtualization scale that I would need for the systems that run the entire ship that I would be using in my operations center locally. Grab any type of cruise line, for example, they would need to also have those type of systems that travel with the ships as well. Now, the cost to have satellite and cost to have these things involved in the ocean is exactly not cheap. With the environment that's now being brought with the Azure Stack, you're actually able to implement the exact same structure and portals and environment into your local environment, unplug it from the internet, let it go on its cruise, and then come back and upload the data that needs to be further analyzed. Now, what's necessary is that there is a connectivity basis that comes in every once in a while, because that's how Azure is doing billing. And this is the key part about the connectivity thing, is that there's no requirement that Azure Stack has to be constantly connected to the internet. But every once in a while, either a secondary model or something has to be able to send that data to Azure, so the billing component kicks into place that allows you to utilize those services and still have the same costs. So this is the interesting fact, and we'll talk about this as we move forward, is how does that pricing model fit in and where do we actually look at this? Now, cloud applications that meet varied regulations, and we were just talking about the ability to have things that you can deploy that has the flexibility to deploy on-premise to meet those regulatory and policy requirements. Things like ITAR, EER, HIPAA requirements, these type of involvements do have certain types of cloud environments actually say that they're certified, but you'll still see organizations shy away from giving that mitigation or migration off to another third party, and this solves that solution from what Microsoft sees or what the Azure environment sees. You'll also have a cloud application model on-premise, which is what we were talking about earlier, is 3 things. 1, having your application delivery lifecycle, having it uniquely the same across the entire ecosystem, whether it's on-prem or off-prem, solves a good amount of headache that happens with DevOps. 1 environment. 2, your deployment models and tools won't change. That's the other side of it. If I'm deploying and if I'm creating code on, say, for example, Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, I can still be able to deploy locally with the same exact tool and still be able to deploy to the cloud, not having to deal with that transition process that we sometimes had to do in the past. That obviously I'm using either Windows Server or RHEL stack, having, let's say, for example, RHEL 7, and actually going through that process of having virtualization on it, and then, okay, well, I'm going to transition to AWS. Well, that's a little bit different. I'm going to go to Azure. That's going to be a little different from what I have to then train my engineers, get my tools up and running, and then kind of figure out those two environments to work. So this makes that cloud environment unified across the entire stack. So if anybody's actually gone through the portal, has anybody actually played around with Azure at all? Here, okay, all right. So we'll see that what's interesting is now, let me just give you an example. So this is an example of a local portal. And this is from the side that you're seeing it, and we'll talk about this in a moment here. And part 2 of the meetup, which we won't have time today, but part 2 of the meetup is actually deploying a development stack that is going to be on-prem, and we'll walk you through how to get a development stack set up locally and how that looks and what type of caveats you'll have in that process, because the development stack is, of course, a free solution for you guys to try out what Azure Stack is and how it kind of works. So this is an example, and why this looks a little different if anybody's used Azure Portal before is because this is actually what Azure's engineers or subscribers or people who are in the business and sales sides would see, and those engineers would see when they would be running it from their side. This is actually when we're setting things up, which is also unique in the product, is that what they want to do is things like this, which is giving the ability to have tenant experiences, right? So okay, well, I want to be a local hosting solution provider. I've got a set of customers, whether it's 20 or 100, and I want to be able to control what pricing schemas I give them, what products I give them, what type of solutions I'm able to produce for them. And from that perspective, we want to be able to actually pull off not only giving a provider the ability to have those solutions set up. So say, for example, I want to be able to have 10 customers be able to use storage accounts on Azure. Well, in reality, if I've got an enterprise account set up, I can turn around and say that my pricing for that storage account is different than my customers, and set up subscriptions and set up offers that are set up for them to log into my on-prem environment and be able to use my on-premise environment as their cloud, which is a very unique way of trying to give vendors that were actually cut out of the process of when the hosting environment changed substantially, that once cloud solution environment came up, a lot of hosting providers either had to migrate their stacks on to be able to keep up with the cost, or basically get out of the business. What this allows you to do is bring some of those things back, because managed solution provider still is a marketplace currently and is still an industry definite environment that is not going to be going away, because a lot of people look at how can they mitigate the risks, how can they make sure that the execution is perfect. So having a managed solution provider is actually beneficial for a lot of organizations. So this answers that option of, well, we want to control the environment, we want to control the pricing, we want to control what the features and the options are. So now let's take a look at what the tenant experience looks like. So this is where what I was explaining earlier was, this is how I can actually choose what type of billing I want, what type of solutions I want, what type of offers I want to create, and then from there execute that into the same Azure portal that a person who would log into Microsoft Service would have the same type of login locally. So let's look.
Tenant,
sure.
Tenant piece is just a subscription from Azure, right?
No. No, and that's a very good question, and I have a perfect, in about 5 slides, I've got a breakdown of how the tenant looks. So we'll talk about that. Actually, a tenancy, think of it as a customer, right? I can assign 5 different types of subscriptions and offers to that one customer, and he can pick and choose on what pricing he wants to go for, right? So say, for example, that, and tenants are isolated. So that is one thing you could think about, is that if I isolate out a tenant, then their resources are completely isolated from another customer or another tenant. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's a customer-based concept, right? This also could mean that I'm splitting out departments, right? So if I'm internal, I want engineering to have these type of offers and these type of services for this price stack that we're gonna have to have them controlled on. And I'm gonna have this for this environment for production or graphic design, for example, and I'll have this for my developers. This is that ability to also control it internally and isolate those resources, but still have the same type of portal, same type of environment that you would if you were using the cloud itself. So let's talk about the architecture and how it kind of looks. So the basic concepts is that we've always talked about is these are usually the 4 main ideas when it comes to what services is utilized in the cloud from a Azure standpoint as well as a local on-prem standpoint. We'll talk about networks, we'll talk about compute, we'll talk about images. Images meaning virtual machines that you have either on-prem or off-prem that you want to bring on. And then of course, storage blobs, which is what Azure calls it. But in reality, this is talking about storage, the ability to actually store your data and utilize it. So how this all comes down to it is to have that one portal and tool that ties everything together. So that's how the Azure portal is set up right now. Now the key thing here is what ties all this together, we all know, is that, and the biggest concern comes in with cloud environments, is security. So how do we work with security and how do we actually mitigate that? This is where kind of a lot of that structure ties back in. So this would be a concept that how Azure would see its environment from the 2 key things that control everything is the portal and your identity access or your security. And everything obviously falls in the middle of that. What tools can you use to gain access to those things, and how secure is those environments? That's kind of the bridge that bridges the resource gap in the middle. All right, so let's talk about kind of how the Azure Stack kind of looks. All right, so one of the key things here is that when you look at the Azure Stack, you have obviously the Windows Server, you're gonna have Web Farm, your controller, then you'll have your virtual machines will have options to have Windows Server, System Center, and your SPF, your database APIs, things like MySQL, and then of course your final things with your service bus. So the idea here is taking all of the items that are generally used in operations and enterprise environments, tying that all together with a standard service management API. The ability to actually have either REST calls done or utilize tools such as a PowerShell or a shell environment, or even application access, whether it's Node.js, either Ruby or C#, whatever type of language you have, and using those SDKs, but having a unified service management API, which is also crucial that not only is it unified locally, but it's also unified from the cloud standpoint as well. So the service management API roadmap, structure, call structure, syntax will be identical from what they're delivering in the cloud, which will then come down to your Azure Stack local environment. And of course, this is where we'll tie that same picture back again, is the service management API is then accessed by either the portal or the tools you have to access those, either programmatically or from the concept of utilizing things like PowerShell or any type of the Azure CLI, command shell, these type of things to actually access that. So this was what was the traditional stack. So let's just break that down a little further, and let's just see how those services actually break down a little bit. So let me just go into here. And one of the key things that Azure has done, if anybody's got a little experience, there was a big shift in Azure a while back. I would say about 2 years ago where the actual shift happened, about last year where it's been a very hard cut. And that is from the old classic model to the new ARM model that they're going after, which is the Azure Resource Manager model, right? So the difference here is the new model allows you to have automation and desired state built right into the design of the structure, but at the same time have a unified experience so that you're using things like XML, you're using things that are very unified and standardized to be able to control your environment. So Azure Resource Manager actually is the key thing that ties the cloud and the on-prem together. So the resources that you would normally see, core services, let me finish off the SQL as well as the web stack. So we have that there. Okay, so additional services you'll see that come up is everything that ties down on additional services and foundational services. And what we mean by foundational is a lot of these services, which it comes to platform, storage, networking, and compute, are required to pull off things like SQL servers and web environments. So maybe, of course, we all know serverless is definitely a drive that's happening. Containers is a drive that's happening. So a lot of this, when it comes to serverless, becomes very obscure to the user. It's something that when the user's getting involved with it, it's you write the code, we execute it in the background. So the background here is you can get that same type of environment because you're still using the same service management API and the same resource management model. So if I want to do a serverless model locally, and I've got a local Azure Stack, I can still pull it off because all of the services are still the same that I'm pulling from that cloud. The odd structure is, well, we know that, for example, Azure Functions, and CTO of Microsoft, Mark Ruzanovich, has clearly stated this, that it looks obscure, but in the background, Azure Functions as the serverless Lambda comparison actually is run on containers. The entire background is built on containers, though we don't see that because when we're running code, it's just simply running code and having it run. That containerized environment is where this is becoming managed for you. So that doesn't mean that when we bring this environment locally, right, and say, oh, well, I want this still the same serverless model, am I going to have to now manage these things? If I want on-prem serverless, can I do it? Yes. And that's the key thing, is that we're keeping the same service management API that you would in the cloud and the same resource manager in the cloud. So how they would build it and automate that stack, they would use that same structure and architecture locally to do it. The odd portion that comes in here is we can control things like pricing, scale, and restrictions on that environment.
Question.
Yeah.
So there is infrastructure associated in the foundation services, right? Who is managing it? The enterprise?
We'll get to that.
Oh.
That's a perfect question. That's exactly what I want to cover, is who's responsible for what. And there's actually one entire slide I've got that covers exactly where the responsibility falls and who's supposed to be managing this and how is this helping me out, right? If I'm going to drop this on my head and start managing engineers and have them turn around and do, well, we're back to infrastructure management all over again, now we're just taking a step backwards. This makes absolutely no sense. Well, actually, it's unique how they did it, so we'll talk about that a little bit further when we get a little bit further down the line. So same concept, we got the portal here. Now, has anybody used System Center here in the data centers environment? System Center, it's the data center management tool that was kind of back in the day. Yeah, back in the day when it was a lot of more on-prem involvement, System Center was the tool that was used to automate deployments, handle environmental diagnostics, and overall concept of the Windows ecosystem. Right, but when I'm talking about back in the day, I'm talking about 70% market share, 80% market share, right? So that's not what it is now. We're talking about 20, 30%. If that, our people are going to put licenses towards System Center and still be able to survive in the type of low-cost solution scenarios we've got. That's why System Center has actually gone to a more of a subscription model instead of a per core, per licensing CPU model. So the difference, what I wanted to bring up with System Center and why I'm even bringing that up, is why are we talking about Azure Stack when we've got Azure Pack? If anybody's heard about Azure Pack before, the concept of Azure Pack is actually trying to bring Azure as that on-prem data center locally. This is what Microsoft has done for about 3 to 4 years. But the key difference here with Azure Pack is that you'll see, let me just bring this up so we can all see this clearly. So the key thing that you'll see here is a lot of times we would have it built right here is built into not only the Windows Server 2012, but we would have to have System Center 2012 R2 and then actually have that then build everything out for us to then have the same environment you would have inside of Microsoft Azure. Now, same concept here, self-service portals, where you've got a subscriber self-service portal that you're going to go to, and then you can choose the same service plans and then have your websites or quote-unquote consumer service plan versus a provider plan, but still lives inside the world of System Center. It's actually an add-on to System Center, what was Azure Pack. So now Azure Pack is now being switched to the Azure Stack. So let's talk about why that's a different and what we're talking about here. And let's just, let's start right there. So first difference. Portals have changed completely where now you're going to give the ability, make it easier so everybody can see it. Now you guys can have the ability to utilize the environment that you would normally have without the key component of System Center being gone. And Windows Server 2016 is part of what this structure is built on, but that's not something you're licensing or utilizing. It comes with the Azure Stack itself, and that's what the kind of background platform that they use. It's a custom design of Windows Server is how kind of Azure was built originally. So that's kind of the direction they go with this. But giving you that foundational fabric management capability without the structure of having to maintain a System Center installation. And a lot of times, if you've ever used System Center previously, this is not a one server deployment. This is usually about anywhere from 1 to 6 machines that would run a proper System Center. And even then, with redundancy to have scale, you'll have many more machines then to duplicate those environments to make sure things don't go down, which this model completely removes from the discussion. Everybody follow me so far? I know there's a lot of questions coming up, which we're going to start hitting now. So let's talk about the key concepts here. We're going to hit all of these points. What's personas, what's a portal, what's identity, regions, all of this in the next few slides. But this is the key concepts that we need to cover on what's the difference between Azure Stack and the Azure environment. So one of the key things here with personas is that you have two main concepts. One, a cloud operator, and the tenant, which is the consumer. So this is where we're starting to get into that discussion of why is there a cloud operator and why is there a tenant? Well, think of it this way. If you are a local solution provider, or if you are in an environment where you need to have local console access, or you need extra level of administration capabilities, you'll be able to see what Azure engineers get to see on their side. So this is where that cloud operator portal comes in. So there's actually an administrator portal, and then there's a consumer portal. The tenant or consumer portal is the exact same portal you would see when you would log into portal.azure.com, identical. But the operator panel is actually a little more detailed, giving you console access, subscription setups, tenant and pricing, and a couple other things that normally Azure engineers or Azure sales environments would see that you actually get access to, part of the Azure Stack. And that's what we were just talking about here, is that it can be configured and manage plans, services, quotas, and pricing to provide resources for their tenants. And again, that is not a requirement. Like we mentioned, this is an option that they're bringing the ability for you to have this part of the stack already. But like we said, this is a unified approach. So if you've got subscriptions inside of Azure already, they're actually usable locally, and that's what you're going to tie your environment to, and actually not have to deal with this environment and still use the same billing structure that you've already got set up and duplicate that right down to the on-prem environment. Now, let's talk about the portals. And this is one thing that I was just discussing about the two differences. So they're each backed by separate instances of ARM. What does that mean for us? From a service API endpoint and scalability endpoint and latency and overall usability, administrators are not making the same calls that a consumer or a user would be on your Azure Stack. If I'm an administrator and I'm doing different things, I actually have a separate endpoints and APIs that I can be calling that are separate from what my users or my engineers or anybody else that's using the platform is going to be using regularly. The cloud provider uses the same administrator portal, uses a different administrator portal than what would be seen on the environment for your normal environment, but the user portal, which is the tenant portal, provides a self-service experience that you would see normally in Azure, portal.azure.com. Go ahead.
Is it a hierarchy, like user sees the setup, which admin also sees?
Hierarchy in what, like the, so the cloud operator defines the hierarchy, right? Yeah. So we can, now that hierarchy could go in a couple of different directions, right? So if I wanted like a division breakup, then I could do it per division.
Sorry, I meant to say the API. So cloud operator can see the entire, all API.
Correct.
While user can see only limited API.
Correct, yes. And the cloud operator can give access to those endpoint APIs that are specific for that user, because we're still using the thing called role-based access control inside of what Azure's built their security on, which is our back system, right? So same concept, and the execution comes down as well. I want to be able to give my engineering department access to storage services only. Then I can give them not only admin access to that, but I can give them user access as well and lock them out to that. And then come over to the other side and say, well, my DevOps team should have full access to the VMs, the tooling, the replication, the databases. That's what they're going to give them access, and then cut them off there and have another team handle virtual machines, for example. So let's talk about identity. Now, there's two key things here with identity. If you're going to utilize Azure Active Directory, it's built right in. You create the identity up top, and it will automatically bring it down to your local environment, and that becomes your auth endpoints. And it's basically like a geo-replicated, I wouldn't say geo-replicated, but technically a replicated directory. It is technically kind of geo-replicated because you guys have a second location now that's on-prem, but having the ability to have more than two is what I consider then replication. But the idea here is, if I'm going to make Azure Active Directory my main identity provider or identity server or user service, then it's straightforward. You basically utilize the environment and have it control your access control, as well as the environment that you need for adding users and auth, which, if anybody's used Azure Active Directory, they've built it a little differently than what would be the old sense of what AD was, because now they've introduced things like SAML endpoints, federation, stuff that would require things like federation services and extra services that we'd have to add on-prem that's now built right in. So if we don't want to do that, then the option is that we can turn around and create our own local directory. And keep in mind that this is something that is an option, but I am in no way, shape, or form trying to say that this is a Windows-only product. And this is where I need to clarify very, very clearly. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the...
Are they still using that term?
What, federation services? ADFS? Absolutely.
The last update, they very much, I think,
This is straight from the Azure docs. So this is for the Azure Stack docs. And I can pull that. We can look at that when we're done.
because they're switching to the last announcement, the last integration, like, I think about 4 weeks ago, they moved to all to an integrated common signing platform, right?
Right, but still, ADFS still has SAML endpoints and has the capability to give you those IDP endpoints that you need for unique scenarios that come up with compliance. So you really don't have a choice on not including ADFS because of the amount of environment that's out there. But yes, they're going towards Auth 2.0, and OpenID is what they're actually shooting for right now. But the difference here is, even when you try to use B2C, things like Azure B2C, Azure AD, there's still a good amount of spread out that's happening between API endpoints and discussions on how us to be able to articulate that from a CI/CD and development environment. So, and currently we're actually dealing with something internally, dealing with B2C, that we want to see if it's capable of handling API call points, and because they've changed that versioning, that's something that's happening as a headache. So ADFS gives you this option where I can do a complete Linux stack, have my user not even have a user authentication service, throw it into MySQL, just have it on database tables, one-way hashed passwords, and start having that auth. But say, for example, I still want to secure my data center and still have the same users connect and use their auth on the cloud that I have as my local. So if this is my local on-prem and I have replication that's done in the cloud and I've got users on my own IDP endpoint, well, Azure Stack will actually deploy the federation services for you to then connect Azure AD with your local on-prem environment and then bridge that auth. That may be something unique or custom that you've done internally. And that's going to be the push forward if you're not using AD, because obviously AD on-prem with AD on the cloud can be used using the tool Directory Sync, and it's pretty easy to get it synced. But when we have our own authentication endpoints or authentication servers or user services, that'll give you that ADFS will bridge that gap between the auth of AD, my cloud environment, and local. Make sense? Everybody with me so far? Now, what gains with that is with ADFS and with AD is all the things that come with the security with it. Utilizing things like key vaults for secrets to access virtual machines, storing things with custom RBAC roles. So you're then extending the security model that was in Azure to the on-prem environment, even though you may have a custom solution that you're using locally, which is a unique bridge that, of course, is still being discussed. Now, this one's for you, man. This is your definition on what a tenant is. All right, so the idea here is I'm creating a tenant. If I create a tenant, I can create 2 different subscriptions and have different offers and services on each stack, where this subscription sees none of this, and this offer could be completely different from this, and even these 2 plans could have different types of services when they're living underneath the same subscription and offer. So that's going to the granular level of even department level control or customer level control that we want to be able to say, well, this offer is for this organization, and when they use plan 1, this is their pricing. When they use plan 2, this is their pricing, and this is how they should set up, or this is their model of usage that we want to control from a resource usage standpoint as well as a visibility standpoint or an isolation standpoint.
And where is this exposed? Because when I log into the Azure portal, I am the tenant, and I can create multiple subscriptions for my subscription for. I normally put a subscription for one client, another subscription for another client. But where do I set up tenants if I log into the Azure portal?
Awesome question. Separate admin portal. That's why. So where I would go to portal.azure.com or portal.localhost. Whatever, it'll be admin.portal.localhost, different portal for the guy who's going to create this, the cloud operator, right? So he's got a separate URL, separate web GUI, separate admin API endpoints, all of that separated out for the cloud operator to do that for them. And again, like I said, this is not a requirement, right? This is something that is beneficial and usable, but I can turn on and just create my standard tenant as it goes through and have my subscriptions be used from the cloud and link them and game over. Just now I'm unified stack between what I had in the cloud and what I have locally. But if I want to go further mitigation and I want to control things,
You got some tenants already that you can show us on?
I will if we have time. I'm hoping we have time. If not, the video that comes up after that, I'm walking you through the whole setup. So I've got the entire dev stack going through how to get it approved from the overall checking system that goes through verification, the installation, and we'll go through the whole tenant setup and see that split. It's about a 45-minute presentation, so I don't think we'll have total time, but it's going to be part of the thing we upload. So you guys are going to be able to see that and get into detail about it.
The link's going to be on the Meetup?
Absolutely, yep. Not only that, we'll also be putting it up most likely on YouTube as well, part of our channel. So we'll tweet that out. But that is one of the key portions of having you guys understand the technology is I want you guys to get your hands on it. So we got ourselves a machine and we actually set it up, which is, we'll talk about some of the requirements that it comes in, but you know, they try to scare you a little bit with what the requirements are for a reason, but we'll explain on how to actually get that done in a very low cost way.
Like right now, it looks a bit abstract. Tenant subscription. Can you give a case, a use case of kind of where this will help? Like what does an example, like say, here's a real world example of a breakdown of how this exact model would fit in.
I think I actually have one. Hold on. I actually have one already in my notes.
It'll stick more into our head if we have a story behind it, right? Because right now, I'm going to forget this. But
Let me tell you, my CEO is going to love you that you just said that. So, okay, so, well, I mean, the 2 things that I wanted to give you was, I don't want it to stick in your mind that this is, I gave you 2 quick, easy examples. I'm a person who used to be a hosting solution provider, right? I'm a company that used to provide these services and I switched into a managed service provider, and now I'm using the on-prem environments as just my own usage, but in reality, when I go to my customer, I'm talking to them about managing their services on the cloud, right? So here's where it changes, where I said, okay, well, you trust me, you trust my data center, and you like Azure. I can now give you the pricing, the control, the tenancies that you would get locally and in my data center, but now you're working through me instead of me going through the cloud.
so this is like for companies like Rackspace.
As an example, which is why I'm saying it's not a required model, right? This is an option you have to gain that business, and also the second use case scenario, I'll get to in 1 second. The second use case scenario behind that is the departmental control, right? Where I can then turn around and say that Well, look at it this way. Say I'm a conglomerate, okay, and I've got 6 businesses underneath me. I can use these in each one of my businesses, and my main tenant is each and every single business. And inside there, they have subs that are built, and those offers are built, but my conglomerate is controlling the billing for the entire organization, right? So now that's an internal case model. That's not something where I'm selling the services again. I want to be able to control it internally and say, and look, the name of the game in enterprises is the more usage you can bundle together, the better pricing you get, right? This is the key part of it. If I can turn around and say that all my data is aggregated, that my usage is this much because of 6 businesses, I can pull all that together now and say, boom, this is all the billing that comes from my account, but I've got 6 different businesses underneath this. There's no way any of those know what's going on and how they're being billed. And again, at the end of the day, they're dealing with what I show them on that structure, right? So that business A, whether it's a DevOps shop or whatever it is, they know that their subscription model for our billing is what they're allowed to do underneath that. Which, you know, with subs, it's not only just cost, but it's also what you're allowed to use on the sub as well.
I would think that most companies would probably use one subscription, but use resource groups to kind of separate that kind of stuff.
That's how it's been done. That's how it's been done, and that's the standard way of doing things. And with RBAC, you can do some beautiful user isolation control, and that's how we built actually a lot of our Azure labs here, is using that role-based access control environment, right? But the issue comes down is things that these unique scenarios that pop up where we do not want VP of Finance to see what's going on with business A. So now he's isolated to his environment using just that sub and that plan environment. But I'm with you, that is a traditional model, and that's why Azure says, if you're happy with that model, we've got the ARM Resource Manager built right in, and run with that model. There's no reason why you have to come off of that model. But this gives you that extra pull to say, well, I used to sell this as a service, I've got that option, or I've got this conglomerate solution, or I want to pull together my data and isolate things in billing. That's where this stuff pops up.
So this aligns very well with cost recovery, right?
Bingo. That's exactly the whole point, is to try and bring TCO back, total cost of ownership, back into your environments by utilizing these type of models that is a little bit unique, that, you know, it's very disruptive. I mean, the concept is, from a cloud solution platform concept, this makes absolutely no sense. Why would you want to bring this right back in locally? This doesn't make any sense. And his question is correct, is how do you understand this from a use case model standpoint? And I hope that kind of configures things out. But when you see the model and you see how it's set up, you'll see what I mean by you can still run the normal way you're doing it. There's no reason why you have to go down this road. You know what I'm saying?
One of the things like, you know, when Microsoft was preaching, like, you know, when I was on the infrastructure side, he's saying, like, you know, the guy said, like, you know, yeah, last year we had $500,000 investment to our data center, like, you know, now what is the benefit of it? Yeah. So Microsoft said, like, you know, hey, that's there, like, you know, but you're paying this much for the license. We instead just use it, like, you know, some compliance areas, you know, you want to have your data in your data center, but majority of the data doesn't belong to the compliance. So, but like if you separate them out, you will be having difficulty managing the resources back and forth for the same account. So bring the Azure Stack and put it on your infrastructure so you can convert everything out. You still have this one single uniform layer of control when everything is owned in this environment. Yet you have this compliance needs of your data needs to be in there, in that server, so it will stay in that server. If you have a homogeneous management in a consistent way. Well, not everything Microsoft said was true to be true. They did the sales guys said it, but like, you know, it worked out very well, like, you know, saying that managing the resources. And it also saved, like, you know, the overall cost we spent on Azure Stack. The converting to the Azure Stack was less than actually otherwise we were paid for licensing. Other things during the operation.
But normally though, kind of that task that you're talking about, normally what people do is have an API type company like Apogee or something that manages APIs at a higher level. It solves that same issue, but in a different way.
Yeah, but like, don't get mixed up with that. This is basically, although in a shop, right, use a lot of times like API, just ignore that and the administrator, like, you know, network administration, systems administration.
But it's resource, right? Resource access to certain APIs.
Wait, well, I'm sorry. What do you mean by ignore admin APIs? Because that's actually a separate call stack. So I'm confused as to what you're saying.
That's not the main
resources underneath, right? Resources has to be still distributed between the. So the another example besides the rack space is large companies. For example, financial industries.
GE is the example I could give that I used to be a consultant for them. So.
They call it as LOBs, line of business.
Yeah.
Every line of business itself is a cost center. So those costs, whatever the resources, there is a centralized IT department who they go and put a request, and they actually go and buy the hardware and everything. And so at this point now it's becoming cloudification. Basically, instead of buying in hardware and doing it, they just the internal IT department just goes submits and spins up extra resources. That's how.
And with your API management, you're actually giving them that extra cost to manage that API across the board. If you're going to unify it on the same stack, that goes away, right? So now you're actually using the same API model that they're going to do for you. Microsoft's like, well, we're just going to do it for you anyway. So let's have a unified API call stack from all of your environments. So that's the push. Now, how that turns out to be in reality as we kind of move forward, we'll see kind of how that reality comes out. Because obviously this is of course, in the end, a product that's been out for a month. So we're talking about something very brand new, very, very, very starting to get talked about and see how it's going to become kind of a normalcy in the industry. So you had something to say earlier, I'm not sure.
I was trying to say the same thing to him.
Okay.
He clarified. Thank you.
But one of the key advantages is by converting like existing resources and solving the compliance issues. Just I'm talking about just why Azure Stack itself, not anything underlying, right? So from Microsoft perspective, I think it just eases up when you transition to the cloud over time. So in the next budget reception, next budget, when you hardware, like once you are like in uniform management API or like management interface, when you next time say like I want to buy more servers for the in your budget, like for now, $100,000 for final servers for next year. Then it's like the other side says like why do you need? Why don't you just use the extensive like elastic infrastructure of Azure? But your side is not elastic. It's still making money hardware. So but that can be expanded and some of the resources can be pushed towards the elastic infrastructure much more seamlessly.
So to build off of that point, the other side of this is also the concept is if anybody's ever used Hyper-V before or KVM in their environments, it's a different approach to how cloud solution providers has given you that same concept. If I want to spin up a resource that I would do on KVM or Hyper-V, it's a very different thing, very different limitations, very different environment, a lot of different speed concepts, issues that pop up. Well, if you like how a cloud solution provider is doing it, that same technology and architecture that they would do gets brought down to your on-prem environment. Where in the past we had either KVM or on Hyper-V as an example, that was very different from how I would do 2 or 3 virtual machines and deploy them out. It's a whole different concept to have my API stack already built right into it, my call stack, my DevOps, all of it's built right in the same platform that I would do in the cloud, I'm doing locally. So going back to your previous question, we're going to hit that discussion, and I pulled this directly from actually about 2 hours ago. I pulled these last 3 slides from the latest doc, so we have them directly from what Microsoft is saying. That's why I kind of literally just did a cut and paste, because I want you guys to see it how they're saying it. I'm sorry if this is a little bit small, so I will actually get into some detail. Hold on, let me go back and see if I can get a... Yeah, they don't give me that option here. I'm hoping if they do. No, they don't. Okay, I was hoping I had a magnifying glass, but okay. So going back to the concept of who's responsible for what, and this is the entire portion of what makes this different versus where we are today. So who operates it? Microsoft operates the main Azure environment globally. Your company or service provider is operating your Azure Stack. Either you do it internally or it's going to be done for you, part of the purchase agreement you do when you get the hardware for this, which is kind of the push they're doing. Who do you contact for support? When it comes to, obviously, Azure, the global environment will be Microsoft, but here, this is going to change. Yeah, this is going to change because this is still talking about the development kit support. What's going to change here, and this was actually pulled from the development kit because this is still the only environment that is being documented right now for local usage, though they have about 3 providers, Dell, Lenovo, and IBM, or one other company that's, I don't think it's IBM, it's one other company that's doing hardware that's built into this that has already been certified from Azure as well. HP, thank you, yes, that's the other one. Yep. The available services, obviously all the products are available, but here, what you'll see is that not only the stack supports a subset of Azure services, and obviously being new, it's going to keep getting added to on stuff that you can do. You can have actual services that vary based on what your company or service provider chooses to offer. Now, this is the other side that gives the model. Say, for example, and this goes after that other use case model. Say that I'm Rackspace. I shouldn't use that as an example. Say I'm a major corporation that does IT solution environments and managed service provider. I want to turn around and I've got over, say for example, 1,000 customers. I'm going to be able to price things differently than what you would get as a small business than what you would get from Azure directly. So then they could turn around and say, well, we can drop our Azure Stack server in your local environment. We'll manage it for you, and you'll go through our pricing schema. They'll set up those subscriptions, and the tenancy is done by them, and the admin portal is done by them. But in the end, the customer still sees it as if it's an Azure portal. They don't see the difference because the customer is using it as a local Azure on-prem environment. They'll just treat it like they're going to grab their subs, add their resource groups, and use it like it would be a normal portal. Make sense?
This opens the potential for somebody to come into your organization and completely replace your IT department.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yes. Not only scale down or how we call it here, change of track, right? Where we, for us, we try and push more, and this is what we do as training, right? We try and push more towards, you've invested in engineers, they can be retooled, some can, to get into that newer environment that's DevOps, those things that'll change from infrastructure management or what would be a traditional stack you would have. Yes, that's exactly another field of bringing back not only solution providers, but also replacement of on-prem infrastructures that haven't been switched out yet and still been lagging and getting on board with this. Resource management endpoints, the same. This is the key thing I want you to see here. Management.azure, management.local. Same concept, but changing it to the call path, which is obviously to a local IP address or FQDN, fully qualified domain name, that will then give you that call path to your local installation instead of the one that's in the cloud, but the code is exactly the same. So I can turn on and say, well, when I want to call here, use this credentials, call here, use this credentials, same code, same script, same everything. Nothing has to change. Portal, same concept. And when I mean by portal, so what you would see at portal.azure.com is what the customer or tenant portal is locally, which is portal.local.azurestack.external. But when I turn around and say admin.portal, that is when we're talking about that tenancy portal and that other extra portal. And what we mean by that is there's a couple things we'll talk about is a lot of the cloud solution providing environment is platform as a service just as much as it is infrastructure as a service. So when you look at PaaS solutions, your marketplace is the key thing here. What do you have in your marketplace that brings that solution down and configures it automatically for you, right? So the execution of that marketplace environment gives you the ability as a cloud operator to say, these images I want from the Azure global portal in my marketplace locally, right? So I want these Linux images, I want this from the top end portal and bring it down, but at the same time, I want my own custom images put into the marketplace. So now I get to create my own marketplace in my Azure environment, which is the same portal concept where I'd go to my marketplace, choose my platform, but now I can add a custom Linux solution or a custom deployment that doesn't need to go through the approval process of getting onto the main marketplace. It's part of my environment that I'm giving locally, which then opens up that CI/CD pipeline for engineers that are local in your own organization, and of course the business model for solution providers that want to get back into this business. The last piece is region. Obviously the difference here is the region is local for your development stack. But remember, the Azure Stack is Azure. So if you want to have multiple Azure Stacks across multiple data centers, same concept of VPN connectivity, same concept of express routes, same concept of all this is still built in to give you that connectivity even locally that you want between your own Azure Stacks as well as the cloud itself. Excuse me. Resource groups, same exact thing. The only difference here, obviously, is that there's only one region to deploy locally when you have it on one server. But if you're starting to tie things together, you can look at the model, and that'll probably stretch. As they develop the product more, they'll give you that connectivity between multiple Azure solutions and then execute that accordingly, right? Resource groups, supported namespace, right? So right here, this is what we were talking about earlier, is the majority of namespaces, if anybody's done any type of stuff that's out of the norm of a normal subscription, you have to activate that namespace on your subscription. Say, for example, if I'm going to use Azure Automation, one time I have to go into that subscription and actually activate that namespace underneath that subscription for usage. So the difference here is the same concept exists, but the naming concepts or the names of those services have changed. So that's the only difference. If anybody's had to tackle this before, it's just a unique way of how they're controlling what namespaces or environments you have on Azure of access control based on it. So if I want to have a standard subscription deploy out that's not part of an EA, I'm a regular consumer, I go in and try to use things like backup recovery vault or key vaults or things like this. If it's not activated the first time, at least once on my subscription, it'll throw an error inside the Azure portal and say, we don't have access to this namespace. You have to go in under the subscription admin where the namespaces are and actually activate that. Same concept as locally, but the namespaces names are a little bit different, but the same idea stands that you can still mitigate those namespace usage. And where that comes in is a little bit out of scope of why there's a benefit of using namespace and stuff. It's a development side of things as well as an administration side of things, and we'll get into that in a kind of a future talk, but that's the basic concept. Now let's talk about, I threw this up as just to give you an example of what's the difference between, let's just grab one service, which is storage, right? So storage is a big thing that's on Azure. Let's talk about what's the difference here and how they're building it out. So we know that SMB file shares, if anybody's the old school style of either FTPing or standard file transfer FTP protocol, SMB shares, the block managed access shares that are part of the classic style of file usage, is not active in the Azure Stack yet, but it will be. It's on the deployment track, but it's not yet supported. Things like data at rest encryption is not there yet. So it's still coming as it's being done, but 256-bit encryption obviously is built right into the cloud. This is still being mitigated down, and part of it has to do with key exchange, right? How to deal with things that have to deal with security, a lot of times has to deal with not only security, but permission. How do you actually allow something to be permitted to do something when you've got it encrypted and secured on a secure key? So Azure has been trying to give you the ability to have HMACs and things that you'll have normally from a encryption or cryptography standpoint, have hardware tools be carried with you. So you're not using the public key infrastructure that Azure is giving you, you have your own that gets built into this. So that's still not yet supported. We'll see that start coming about as we move forward. General purpose and Azure blob storage accounts. The idea here is before you could specify, technically right now you could specify in the Azure Global Platform whether you want to give a general purpose on the Azure storage account, choose whatever types of storage you want, just drop and let it figure it out, or you can restrict it to the type of blob and local storage that you want to do. You only have one option there. And this is kind of a breakdown where you'll see things start to change. Blob size, 4.75 terabytes is the current size maximum requirement inside of the global portal. It's stuck to 195 gigs right now locally. So this is where they're making things change and understanding how that structure will bend out, because you're not sitting on a couple $1 million or a couple $1 billion data center solution that in the end is part of that environment. So okay, we'll go through this. 8 terabytes, 1 terabyte, 512 on the page blob size. So you can see a lot of this is being chopped down but being brought back to normalcy. As they'll develop the product, it'll go up. Go ahead.
Now, are you talking about the maximum capacity that can offer on the global? Why is there a discrepancy? If the stack in the Azure Global can handle blob size of 1024 characters, how is it different from the stack, Azure Stack on-prem?
Two things. I don't believe from the architecture that I've studied that there's actually an architectural difference. This looks like a service limitation difference that they've done while they're developing and testing it out as it goes out in the market. The structure, the API, the overall calls are all the same, so the environment shouldn't be different. What it looks like is these are limitations being put on the system as they're scaling this out and testing things out to make sure that can they increase it? Can they give you maximum? Do they need to put limits in? Because in the cloud, like I was saying, was I've got a data center. If I want to go above capacity, I'm starting to use more than just my normal rack. But this is if I'm going to buy one rack and have it sitting in my environment, then I'm limited to just that. So there may be not a possibility for me to have 4.75 terabytes on each and every account that I have locally. By the time I hit the 100 or whatever 200 terabytes I have in there, there has to be a way to limit that, whereas in the cloud, you use what you need. It's not a concept of scale. So I think it's a balance of trying to figure out how to mitigate that from you're already limited by what you have bought from that concept and how to give that warning or give that environment where it doesn't stop productivity or doesn't stop scale or agility, right? Make sense? So let's jump into a little bit of the Stack development kit here. Okay, so what are we talking about from an Azure Stack development kit? What do we want to look at and why are we talking about this? Well, how Azure is trying to push this product is by utilizing hardware that is managed for you. And this is the big difference on the question mark that the gentleman had earlier, was the approach that's done for your environment has to be where you're not bringing extra costs or extra headache back onto your plate. So Azure's pushing that you work with a service provider or a hardware provider that deals with the hardware directly. So what their model they're looking for in the end is to have an environment where Azure itself gives you the services and they give you the support for those services, but if there's a problem with the hardware, the manufacturer of the hardware will cover that automatically, part of the cost of the product you got. So that is where the question gets answered. Well, the VMware system that I've got on there virtualized is causing problems with the Azure Stack. I'm having issues with communications and now my drives just died. Well, we don't want you to go back into infrastructure work, is what Azure is saying. Turn around and have the hardware provider deal with that, and we will deal with your services, part of the Azure environment. And it is basically kind of set, use, and go, and issues are on us to deal with. And of course, the cost with support always comes down to response time and how much money you want to pony up to have somebody else do this for you. So that comes down to a kind of a game where people will basically pay in blood to sometimes not have to deal with an outage, when in reality that's a significant amount of cost they're actually ponying up to deal with that. So
will you deal with your DR strategy yourself, or is it
part of the structure, right? And that's the key thing about them, is that they don't want you worrying about that. But where it comes down to it is, if I've got compliance and my DR structure says that I need it locally, and say I need it in a tri-state FECTA, right? That's part of my compliance policy I have. I can tell then my environment to purchase that environment and set it up. But if something goes wrong, like one of the servers goes down, then it's not on me. It's on the hardware manufacturer, and they have to support that. Instead of me going back into the old infrastructure days, dealing with drive swapping out and going through that whole headache, that was part of where we switched from the agility that we came into. So, okay, well, when we talked about all that, I wanted to cover that because the development stack that's coming from Azure is because they're giving you a single server deployment to test locally, where you don't have to pay for the hardware from a already solution provider or get into a contract with a hardware manufacturer. You can buy one piece of device. Maybe you already have this on-prem that you can then use as a development test to try and see what the Azure Stack is and how it works. And that's one of the demonstrations we'll do in the second part of the video, is to actually walk you through a bare metal server. We're going to set it up, go through the installation of the Azure Stack, show you the network requirements that are there, the storage requirements, get it up and running, and then deploy resources and show you the connectivity that'll happen between the global Azure environment and your local on-prem. And I wanted to actually get this set up for you guys so you guys understand where we're coming from before I jump into like something like a demonstration like that, because then it's kind of going to be like, well, why are we even doing this versus we already got the cloud? What's the benefit? And that's where this setting that baseline is, what is Azure Stack and where we're coming from. So the development kit architecture is this, and this is a little bit confusing, but I'll go through these services in detail a little bit. I'll stick on them to a certain extent, but the idea here is this is the one single server that gets deployed. None of this is done by yourself. First point. Second point is definitely needs to be drilled home. You are not setting this up. This is automated, done in the VHDX or the VHD file that comes from the Azure Stack development environment. You simply have to deploy that VHD. It will configure this entire stack for you, set up the portal, set up everything, and get your development environment completely done. It comes from the structure from them about a 10 gig download and expands out to about a 65 gig OS setup that goes straight on there. So that's why the requirements are a little bit beefy when we talk about what they want for a single deployment scenario for you to get approved. And we'll talk about ways to get around that a little bit, though Microsoft won't recommend that because they don't want you to have, and their point is semi-correct, but I'd like to give you guys the ability to test this out with any budget, right? So that's why I'm going to give a little bit of a different recommendation. But the concept here is you do not want to have something where you're setting something up and comparing it to Azure, and because you didn't follow the minimum requirements, you are not getting the same level of service quality that would be in the cloud that you should be getting locally, because that's supposed to be a mirror of the cloud solution environment you would have in the global cloud, right? So this is the structure that would be set up by the automatic development kit. So you'll have a NAT that's already set up, a network access translator or a NAT service that's built in. You have a public switch and a software switch that's built into the Azure Stack networking. The entire structure is built on Hyper-V for the stack and on top of a custom server 2016 development kit OS host, which you're obviously not paying for. This is part of the stack that gets deployed out. And this is the stack of infrastructure roles that you can have, from domain controllers to certificate authorities to ADFS solutions to all the way down to load balancers and the other types of services that come inside of that normal Azure resource environment that you would use as a product itself. Okay, so let's talk about this real fast. And we've got a few slides left and we'll get into some discussions because we're just 5 minutes away from our closeout time here, so for us to sit down and just start talking. So from a hardware standpoint, this kind of looks scary, which is, you know, a little bit where it becomes, yeah, this is out of budget for a lot of people to try and just test at home and kind of have fun with. So there's a reason for it, and there's actually some tricks I'll tell you guys here that there's ways around this that actually makes it affordable and still be able to test. So let's go through this real fast. One of the things here is the disk drives. And this is the confusion part. When they say disk drives, well, you need disk drives and disk drives. What are you talking about? OS disk, data disks. Very different from each other and required to have 4 data disks. Now, what's interesting is that below this documentation, they talked about doing RAID and whether you want to do RAID or not. It can take some RAID, but it's not required. The key thing is to have the same type of drives, right? So if you've got SAS drives or you've got SATA drives, you want to be able to have the same style drives and the same capacity for those 4 data disks. They have to be identical with a minimum of 140 gig capacity, and the OS should be around 200 gig. And this is why we gave that example, because the OS is 60 gigs alone on just the Azure Stack itself. So if you want to throw on some, you know, marketplace images and stuff that you want to do, say I want to drop 3 or 4, one Windows Server, one RHEL stack, one, you know, Ubuntu stack, you're looking at easy anywhere from 10 to 60 gigs. You just add it on top of the normal OS that's running. So that's why they're saying the OS disk should be a little bit bigger than what is used. Dual socket 12 core. Whoa, all right, you're starting to get some real compute power here versus what would be a normal person that is looking at either a dual core or a quad core environment. How are they going to pull off this in a cost solution standpoint and make any sense? Well, there's ways to get around that. We'll talk about this. 96 gigabytes of RAM, which is a substantial amount of RAM. That is not a small amount, but remember, we're talking about virtual machines, and yes, I've gone through the days of dealing with dev stacks where I've got 3 gigs of RAM and I'm still running about 3 different virtual machines and still getting my development done. So crazy ways to do things, not the best way, but definitely possible.
Like, instead of having one machine of this, like a primary server of this, it doesn't make sense. Because you always have, this is a controller, right?
No, this is the Azure Stack. This is the entire stack. The host, the VMs, all of it come underneath this one machine. One machine.
It's not the controller.
Not the control is built into this.
Yes,
This
but
is not the production solution. This is just the development kit.
For testing. But this is the one which is hosting the containers.
yeah, but why do you host it on one machine?
That's because this is not the final production version.
No, but that's the point though. Why would you not want to?
Why do you see one of the things IO is still a big drag, right? Disk IO is still a big drag, and obviously your bus speeds and the processor throughput has increased significantly over time, but IO is still a drag. So by spreading over the machines, you have a much more predictable performance levels rather than sitting on one and one of the machine a developer like me, in my 2001 AI implementation, I just grabbed out my whole infrastructure IO and just blocked everything out.
Well, that's the whole point of the subscriptions and the plans and all that. That stops you from doing that, right? So this is where you're controlling your engineer's capability, the operational standpoint, but still mitigating your cost of ownership, which is the key part. If I need to deploy 6 different Azure stacks just to get the reliability, this is saying you could do it in one. And obviously this is a testing environment. His point is absolutely correct. This is not what they would call you to use in production, and they would absolutely freak out if you tried to use something like this in production, right? But the conceptually wise is, look at the jump. Recommended is already jumping everything automatically. So 1 point of loss is a different discussion entirely, right? But if I'm talking about TCO, total cost of ownership, this is a model that's very hard to beat. To be able to have your controllers, your virtualization environment, and your disaster recovery scenarios on one machine is, hard to combat. Because servers can have redundancies built in, from hard drives to its UPS systems. Of course, latency and these things are discussions, and you can look at that from a production standpoint. But this is in the end a development difference here, is that we're talking about something for developers to try the platform out.
But to this point, he's saying, why do you have such a beefed up server instead of taking one single server, split it into multiple servers, commodity servers, which are not super expensive.
What's the difference?
Horizontal scaling not that, right?
What's the
In
difference? Why is it
2007,
just a virtual machine?
yes, in 2007 we had to build an entire data center on a Friday evening when my CIO showed up. Oh, I forgot to forward this email last month. Okay, and eucalyptus. Pretty reliable. It worked for the next 2 years. With Home Depot got we got an air conditioner right from the Home Depot, and put up all your commodity desktops on there, and just 40 machines and built out about 35 VMs and within a eucalyptus stack. But the whole point is you can still get that reliability with 1 or 2 failures. On higher end machines like this, still you have a single point of failure. And yeah, there the single point of failure, we had 2 redundant controllers in that. But having a development on a spread out systems, on a laterally expandable elastic system is far more reliable. Even today's date, yes, 96 GB RAM on a Windows machine is not a big deal these days. You get a couple of Patriot, already almost 60 GB chips, right? You get these days, yeah, you can stick it on, but the whole thing is even for a home machine I'm talking about. But I was just wondering, what made them have a decision like this?
So we can cluster everything.
Yep. Yep. It's a development kit. That's the entire point. The development kit is supposed to give you the ability to actually have that resiliency, but
we can still split.
the split is going to happen based upon the hardware manufacturers that you're going to deal with, right? Because this is going to come from them, and this is how they're going to if you're going to tell them that you're going to have a 100 terabyte or petabyte solution that you want, they may say, well, that's going to take 4 servers that are set up in Azure Stack environment for you to actually have that, for us to back it and give you the SLA that comes with that, right? So they're going to dictate that. Not you, not Microsoft, not anybody else. It's the hardware manufacturer's going to say, you want the SLA, this is how many machines you got to get, this is how you got to set it up, and we'll manage it for you.
This is kind of the marketing, as, correct me if I'm wrong, but is this being marketed as like a hyper-converged setup? Where storage, CPU, memory, everything is in one piece of hardware?
Bingo.
In one rack.
Correct.
Yep. And you can even pull it off in a 1-unit rack, which is what Bhuvan is actually talking about right now, is having low-cost options for this, and we'll talk about that. You know, the idea here is obviously they have, these numbers look very odd, but to achieve this can be done in sub $400, $300, and I can explain how. Obviously, you wouldn't use, and that's what I'm about to explain, because I just built that stack. Right, that's what I just built, and that was the whole point, is I wanted to enable you guys. Exactly, but the problem is this is not able to use in production, and obviously there's a bunch of stuff that they tied to the subscription and all that jazz that comes with it. But I want you guys to be able to try this. So there are ways to get around the concept that they're giving you here and still pull it off. I don't need the latest Xeon processor. 5 years ago still has a hex core that's a dual processor that's $200 of a server from Supermicro that will do the same level of limitations and pull off the same amount of RAM. And I have a receipt, and you'll see that when I do the second part. My receipt came out to $375. I pulled this entire thing off, right? So this is not something that's not doable, but obviously would I recommend that equipment for production? Absolutely not. But can you mess around with it? Yes, absolutely.
Just in FYI, we just put in, like, we are launching a desktop computer. We just actually finalized the OEM design and we confirmed it yesterday for bulk production. We are getting it for $40, a 8-core desktop, and with 48 Mali 450 cores.
Yeah, no, that's standard. I mean, cost for computing has come down substantially. And like I said, when you're buying either in bulk or be able to pull off good agreements and good deals, cloud computing costs can come down substantially. But the concept does come in is going back to what the gentleman asked earlier, and what was mentioned is trusting the VM stack, but also trusting the hardware manufacturer and the service provider to remove the headache off your hands about DR and other things that were questioned kind of earlier. But the main concept here is let me finish this out, is you have to have Hyper-V enabled. Obviously having SLAT, which is the key thing, is some processors call this VTD, some processors have different types of technologies, but you should have something within the last 2 to 4 years that gives you most of the virtualization and data transfer options that the CPU core should be built on and enabled from its own architecture instead of having like BIOS mitigator or something like that. Why all this is coming through is actually there's an installation checker, and the installation checker goes through and double checks all of this. And even then, if you try to even go around the installation checker, because it's a simple PowerShell script, you can edit the script and have it, go through. But when it actually goes to do the cloud VHD is when it's going to do a hard test and freeze the installation if it doesn't get to these minimum requirements that it needs to for the development stack to get approved.
So it is needed.
Oh, this is not an option for the development stack. But what I'm saying is you can do this in a low-cost way. Microsoft is saying buy a Dell development stack tester, which is $3,000 to anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000. An HP, also HPE Enterprise, I think there's a development kit also that you can get from Microsoft or HPE themselves to get that, where I said that you can pull this off and get it approved with something that I wouldn't recommend for production, but in a very low-cost way to at least get you up and running and try this. And actually their point was, on the other side, was 2 things. One, they're expecting people who are doing Azure Stack to have data centers, right? Their concept is you already have something on-prem, and you probably already have a machine like this sitting in there that won't harm you in pulling that unit out and putting it into development and see what it can do. That's one concept. The other one is don't compare something when you're not giving it what it needs, and that's what they're worried about. You compare what Azure services are doing on-prem versus off-prem, and that comparison will then have a problem if you're not giving it what it considers a norm for its environment for you to deal with.
Yeah, so performance should not.
Which is a huge problem. I mean, when I go to testing and I'm not seeing what I should be seeing on-prem versus what's off-prem, the product's out the window. I'm not going to even waste my time and give my entire departments all the headache to go through this when it's not performing the way it needs to. So that fear has driven them to this point. So let's jump to this real fast. The current services available on the dev kit are the foundational services, which is compute, storage, networking, and key vault. Compute meaning you can do virtual machines, you can handle key vault, you can handle networking, and you could do the basic concept of what storage is without some of those extra items. And when I mean by extra items, I'm talking about like things like SMB file storage. I'm not talking about NoSQL databases and stuff that was part of table storage, and all that can still be done locally on the Azure Stack. It's these extra little things that were done to have those legacy applications built on. They did not bring them in yet to the local stack yet. So let's talk about this. What your network should look like to set it up. One, the subnets. You should not hook up the host machine. And remember, this is going to build a virtual network stack internally. So your host machine still has to communicate with your network locally so you can talk to it and it can talk to the world. That is where we talk about some of this, where having a switch and having these subnets not be connected. So if I'm going to do a local test, I can't have my host system connect to anything that has these subnets, because that's what's being used internally for the dev stack and the Azure stack that you're going to deploy, whether it's VMs or other things like this. So you want to avoid this on your host subnet configuration. Switch requirement is only there if you have something that you need it. Their only thing about switch and why I'm mentioning it is because the Azure Stack does have the ability to do VLAN tagging and be able to choose your environment for layer 2, layer 3 routing if you need to be able to handle that. And part of the setup process, you can define your VLAN IDs so it'll make sure that it picks up the IP addresses or be able to route traffic on the network properly. IPv6 versus IPv4, only IPv4 is available right now, which is kind of the norm, that's usual. DHCP, it is only needed if you don't have the ability to understand how to set up a static IP address. So if you've got a DHCP, whether it's on your own router, great. If you don't need it, you don't have it, you can go in, define the static IP address in the settings whenever it's going through the setup process, and then launch it, and it'll just go through forward. And the internet connectivity is needed for this guy from the concept that you want to be able to do some of the things like pull marketplace images and be able to handle them, but it is not required for you to set it up. I don't need to be installed. I don't need to be connected to the internet. Like when I did this setup, the machine was like in a whole nother room compared to where I even had connectivity access. The VHDI download is enough to get my stack set up. And then if I want other things from that, I can then bridge it in either from a local PC and transfer it, or RDP into the system, or use the web portal to get access to that. Okay. Let's talk about the deployment process and how it works. So first step, you should run the checker. And how that works is you want to drop the checker onto the environment for your host before you deploy the initial deployment stack. So what they recommend is to have a Windows Server 2012 already installed on the system so you can run the checker to make sure that the system crosses the minimum requirements. You do not need a license for this because you're simply doing it just to onboard the system, get it set up, tested, and then after that, it's going to wipe it out and install a brand new customized stack OS that's part of their environment, part of the VHD that's going to come in. Basically, right, that's it. And even then, they didn't even require that it be a certain level. It should be a Windows server that can run that level of PowerShell script. That's all they care about, because that script is what's giving you the... And in reality, you don't even need to do that. Their concept is you want to just deploy it, you deploy it. But if you get stuck and the requirements are not done, the system will then stop and you're kind of stuck in your hands where, you could have double checked it and maybe it was...
Checking yourself before you try.
Exactly. That way, simple things I had a problem with where I obviously had a 1-unit rack which only 4 drives, and how I pulled off a 5th drive was little bit of fun. But it wouldn't recognize it the first time because of the way I had it kind of daisy chained through the system. So I had to switch it up and make sure that it understood it as a SATA drive and actually saw it the same as the rest of the OS disks and let it go through. So that was kind of a hurdle that you'll see, that make sure that you run this checker first. That's my recommendation. Second thing is, once this check is done, you launch the Cloud Stack a VHD. That will then run another check, and that check is a lot more detailed and granular. It's going to go through and make sure your NIC is up to speeds. It'll make sure your hard disks are up to the sizing requirements, your free space right, and all that's taken care of, which is where the extract and boot the Cloud Builder VHDX. Rest of the install is all straightforward. After that, you go in and simply then concepts of what your IP addresses are, where your endpoints will come in. Then you can obviously add things like local DNS names and kind of set it up so you can have some ease of environment of deployment. So we're coming, yeah, go ahead.
Why is the third point required? 2012. That's it's not a Moodle, or it's not Moodle, right? It's just Bronze Iconics.
No, the 2012, which I think you missed that part. I was just discussing that with him, is the 2012 is used to check the system. You don't want to check the system, you can run the straight Cloud Builder VHDX and boot it straight off of there, but now you have no way of knowing what happened. The installation could fail and just kick back and say that this is not acceptable and you have an issue, right? To onboard the stack and to test it properly, they recommend to throw on a non-licensed server, Windows server, where you can run the scripts, test everything, deploy out to VHDX, and then forget it, because after that, it's going to wipe it out. It won't exist after that. All right, we're coming to the end here. We're going to talk here real fast. I got 2 or 3 slides left. I skipped a little bit because I want to go through that in our demo. But this is the roadmap, right? So let's talk about the roadmap where Azure Stack's going. Estimated availability, the idea here is, so you'll see this in calendar year 2018, a lot of things that we would normally see as a normalcy, such as Travis and Bamboo integration, is coming up, but isn't fully integrated into the stack just yet, which is obviously going to happen from a concept of a future roadmap. But this is what's currently available, and you can see there's certainly things that are coming up. What's that? This is where I'm going to have you read right here. Okay, so that answers that question right there. Can we do individualized nodes and actually have it on resiliency in a lateral scale, right? The agility is built in, but not on your development kit. So that's the difference here, right? So the concept comes in is fully automated failback with Azure Site Recovery. That's the whole point, right? To be able to have that unique configuration connection between the two, and that's all coming down the line, but they want to throw this at you guys so you guys can be able to use it. Oh, excuse me. I pulled this as the most recent approach to what they have that's available worldwide, where the stack is not only going to be supported from the hardware standpoint, but also from the Azure Services Global standpoint as well. So this will give you a concept of whether you have a geographical presence or not. This is going to give you that concept whether that global support is there for the hardware and the software that they're going to be deploying through this whole process, which is not a bad list from what is normally from a launch standpoint. Looks like they've got a decent amount of the earth covered, but in the end, this is all going to see how this is kind of spirals out as the products are ordered and things are kind of set up, and see how things kind of go. All right, so we're at the discussion and QA, guys. I'm just going to go through this real fast. Join our community. We've got a Slack channel. We've also got our online thing because we like to talk to you guys. So we've got a free community that's available, as well as the ability for you guys to jump on a community Slack and ask questions, get involved, talk to us. Any type of issues you have, anything you want to learn, anything you want to share, we're always available for you guys. That's why we're here. Number 2, we're hiring. You guys know anybody that's interested in getting into this environment of teaching or wanting to be able to be part of a kind of future solution of e-learning, get on the cutting edge of this industry, get involved with us. We're always looking for good people, always looking for team players that want to help others out and succeed in the future. So this is crucial for us. She's also there if you guys got any questions for this as well, from that concept, because for us, talent is what allows us to help you guys out, and that's the key thing here. Well, we're looking at both models because obviously we have a new product called Cloud Assessments, and we'll get into that in a moment here. But sign up for the free community edition. Obviously, that's where the community is for Linux Academy, but let's just talk about cloud assessments real fast and I'll stop this out. So the difference here with cloud assessments is that we've got a new product that we've just launched recently. The idea here is for you guys to take a look at practical learning, right? The real change here is instead of just giving you a lecture or giving you a slide or turning on and saying, go take this quiz or do this exam dump and turn around and have this lab and run with it, we want you to have engrossed, hands-on practical knowledge of what you're doing. So we have scenario-based, story-based learning that throws you in an environment and has you go through a set of objectives so you can then pick up that knowledge. And we're not talking about just simplistic stuff like, okay, set up this network. No, we want to go into things like, well, this is how you set up a machine learning algorithm. This is how you run your R scripts. This is what you're going to set up for that environment to execute those things out with big data, IoT, DevOps, Cloud Stack, whatever it is, but have the hands-on practical knowledge from a usability standpoint as well as a cutting edge resource standpoint. And Cloud Assessments is in beta right now. It's free. Guys, jump on it, try it out, get involved with it. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you think we should add, we should definitely subtract, because giving you guys knowledge and seeing you guys succeed is what makes us enjoy our jobs and do a better job every day. And that's, in all reality, why we all actually work where we work here. So that's it, man. I'm gonna leave it open to you guys. And we will go from there. Any questions, any discussions, anything you guys want to talk about, more than welcome, please.
Say what